technical note, this is being streamed on Twitter Spaces. You can join on your phone and listen. For those listening, welcome. However, we're going to do the main part of this via Zoom with those who registered. And at the same time, the whole thing is going to be streamed on YouTube, and there will be a recording on YouTube afterwards if you want to watch it later. I shall post that on our site, and a special page called IntelliNews.com/welcome, where there's also an invitation to take a trial to what we do, the premium content that we produce news-wise. So I'm very pleased to be joined today by Elena Rybkova. She's Deputy Chief Economist at the, what is it, the Institute for International Finance?
The Institute for International Finance.
Yes.
Washington-based.
Isn't that associated with the IMF? I mean, don't you provide policy research for them?
Well, we communicate with them closely. No, the history of it is more when the fund was not so public about their research and their assessment of countries. This was almost like an outpost created by global banks, first of all US based, and now it's international. It's EM and a big chunk is European, and also asset managers and increasingly even tech companies.
Right.
But the original idea was to provide research when the IMF was not providing it. So you had a lot of people migrating from the fund to this Institute of International Finance.
And it's a top fund. I read her notes closely. They're guaranteed to put you to sleep, but they're full of interesting things. So the topic on the table today is sanctions. How bad can it get? And this whole story has got pretty crazy. And the sanctions are predicated on the threat of possible invasion by Russia into Ukraine. And then these sanctions would kick in. And there's been a whole string of various sanction laws. And despite the fact that here at BNE, we're pretty convinced that Russia is not going to invade Ukraine. And so these sanctions won't be triggered. It is possible that there are some lower level military actions by Russia, disabling Donbass, possibly a land bridge to link Crimea to Russia. And so these sanctions could be used, maybe not quite as advertised, but they definitely should come in. And also, we've been taking the line that sanctions as a policy is pretty played out, that Putin's fiscal fortress and the pay down of debt makes it very difficult to get at him or Russia. Nevertheless, what they're proposing from Biden administration and many European countries are extremely painful sanctions. They've been threatening him with quote unquote massive consequences. So we want to have a look and see what exactly is being proposed and how painful they are. So, Elena, if you don't mind, what I did this morning was I went through the bill and I made a list. And I thought it would be useful if we just sort of go through it and talk the points one by one. And then after that, I think we can have a brief discussion about disruptions, because parallel to the sanctions, there's things that are not on the list, but things like the ruble, the asset market, which are already being affected. Maybe we can have a quick look at those. So if we spend a few minutes on each, I think the easy one to kick off with is Nord Stream 2. And it seems there's no dispute about that one. If there is some military action, then Nord Stream 2 will be just shuttered, and that will be the end of it. Is that how you understand it?
That seems to be the communication, very clear communication from the US, and US can do that via secondary sanctions, and we can speak more about that. It can also do it via direct sanctions, but secondary sanctions is probably the easiest. The Europeans also talked about it, and you saw various government officials from Germany, from where you're sitting at, commenting that they will stop Nord Stream 2. Legally, it will be interesting how they will have to do that, because Nord Stream sort of qualified through most of the loopholes. It's in the last stage of approval process that might, if abstracting from US-Russia situation right now, could have gone in the second half of the year just to pretty much be approved. So it will be interesting what Germany would come up with as a reason and sort of legal framework for shutting it down.
So surely I've just been assuming that that they won't give it the regulation sign off that it's been waiting for. I mean, you're saying that there's other things they can do, because before they were talking about sanctioning German companies, and the Germans obviously got really upset about that.
So the US exactly can go sanctioning European companies, and that is, and we can spend actually some time a little bit on that because Europeans haven't been very happy about that at all. Germany can just give not regulatory approval, but if Germany is sticking strictly to the rules of the regulatory approval, and it has been until recent change in rhetoric, is that we're sticking to it's a market-based systems, we have regulatory framework in place, this is what we do. So then they will have to find a way to say, well, now we're changing our regulatory approval process because of political, geopolitical reasons.
Yeah, then you get sued though, don't you? Because I mean, that's the problem. I mean, the oligarchs have just sued journalists and saying like, you're not holding us to the same standards as you hold everyone else. And you could argue here is the same thing, that this is overtly political. And then that's actually illegal in Europe and you get sued.
Exactly. So that's why it's not yet clear what are other legal venues they have for stopping these projects. And it's also interesting that German officials have left it purposefully rather vague in terms of what we might do, right? It's not very specific. In the US, of course, you know, we have the existing bills, and also the administration has the capacity to move in with secondary sanctions on European companies.
Is this SDN list? Isn't that the main tool here, the sanctioned nationals list or companies list? You get put on that list, and then that gives the US special powers to sanction you. And they can use that list and just add anyone they want. And specifically, they can add a European company and say, well, actually, it's legal what you're doing, but under this special power, we can fine you.
Absolutely. And there's even, that is one venue, and it's almost more direct sort of way of sanctioning. There's also an indirect way where companies that do something that US does not like, a foreign company, might also lose access to the US financial markets and the dollar. And that is almost even more meaningful, as we saw in the case of Iran in 2018, where nobody will then dare touch the project or the payments.
Because this morning there was a report that the US were now threatening to hit, the FT was reporting that it was going to sanction new oil and gas projects. And the analysts were saying, well, this is mildly negative for sentiment, because they were saying there are really two really big projects, Gazprom's Baltic LNG and Novatek's Arctic LNG 2. They've actually been signed off. The final investment decision has been made. And so they don't qualify as new, although it could be complicating in the future. And the technology too, that Novatek has got its own LNG technology, so you can't stop that going. And in that sense, it seems somewhat symbolic, but on the other hand, this is like a long-term risk. It just adds to the risks. But it's the same sort of problem, isn't it? That the US are going to target a project and have to put it on the SDN list as a way of stopping anything happening there.
That is true, but you're also taking us to very interesting territory of European economic sovereignty. And you probably saw that the European Commission just proposed a new tool for defending Europe against economic coercion. And this origins of that whole tool, and it's going through, presented to Parliament, and there are legislative changes that they're proposing and specific recommendations where the European Commission would evaluate what consists to be a source of an incident of European coercion against Europe, and then what the next steps which should be done in response. And it's interesting that this concept of European economic sovereignty developed partially as response to China, partially as response to Russia, but also importantly, partially as response to the US. So it's sort of US doing something unilaterally, even though politically maybe there is an agreement on this, would not, I think, sit well with European authorities, especially in the context where we're talking about developing tools, particularly against the US sanctions.
Indeed. I mean, there's a nasty clash here in so much as the Germans have pushed hard for Nord Stream 2 because they want the gas, because ironically, although it's being sold as a threat to European energy security, it actually improves it because it just gives you another route. More gas gives you access to the Arctic markets. And it's even more complicated because companies like OMV, the Hungarian energy company, is actually an investor into Nord Stream 2, and so their interests are very much aligned with Russia. And I think we've been at BNE been saying that recently the alliance between the US and Europe is starting to show cracks. That there's some serious arguments about what should be done, which actually should bring us on very smoothly to SWIFT. because that's where it's most glaring, is that the Americans have been talking about it. I was just reading a news report just out that the Biden administration has been briefing the top banks in America about the implications, and they've all been asking about SWIFT in particular, because that threatens to spill over into financial markets and cause instability. The Germans specifically said they're afraid of that. And of course, if you cut Russia off from SWIFT, it makes it very difficult, does it not, for Europe to pay for its oil and gas?
So this is a very important issue, because would you like to sanction the International Monetary Fund? I mean, I'm being a bit controversial here, but SWIFT is akin to that, right? It started off as a payments messaging system. So what is SWIFT? SWIFT doesn't settle things. SWIFT provides you an opportunity to message between banks for international transactions. In some countries, it has also moved into domestic transactions. But for example, in the US settles everything domestically via the domestic Federal Reserve System. So SWIFT is mostly for the international trade. In the old days, in the 60s, we had telex and we had phones. But nowadays, we pay for each other via these transactions. It's not always the most efficient, but it has its obvious benefits. But it is a consortium. It's like a cooperative of global international financial institutions. It also has a supervisory board, by the way, which Bank of Russia is on it. But it has a G10 and I think another plus 15 countries that are also on that board, because it's so important for global financial stability. So it is almost like sanctioning the IMF or the World Bank.
But what if it was a financial crisis? I mean, if you block the Russians from it, how does that destabilize the financial system?
From one day to the next, you will not be able to pay for exports and imports a gross amount of over 600 billion. That's it, very simple. Right. So what's going to happen to the global financial markets? We had a hiccup with Rusal. That will be barely noticeable hiccup in context.
But even that, I mean, Rusal, when Deripaska was sanctioned in 2018, the prices for aluminium on the market the next day shot up 30%. And it highlights to what extent Russia's economy is already deeply integrated into the global economy. It's not like, it's not like Iran sitting there by itself, doesn't really have much to do with anyone. It's a major integral part of the global economy, particularly in the supply chains for energy and metals. These are basic things. And if you suddenly take it out, you're saying that just creating that huge hole in the market from where Russia was is in itself inherently destabilizing.
It will be cratering. Majority of European companies rely for more than 50% on Russian gas imports for their gas supply. And you have a good sort of 10 or so countries that it's over 80%, say 7 countries over 80%. The average is 40 for EU 27. There are opportunities for LNG to try to compensate for that. There are terminals, as we know, in the UK, Spain, France. And the capacity utilization is there, not at the max, but it's only a small percentage of total supply that Europe needs. So paying for that will become impossible overnight if you were talking about disconnecting the whole country.
So in the bill, the American bill, they also included sanctions and the ability to sanction messaging services, other ones. Is it that because the Russians they set up their own payment system? The Mir one is for credit cards for regular people. I forget the name of the interbank one, but they have an interbank system.
SPFS, Financial Communication System. Yes.
And from what I've read, it works. It's not as efficient and it doesn't have the capacity that SWIFT does, but it does work. And presumably, because the infrastructure is all there, they'll just roll it out. And the Chinese have been anticipating this. And so Russia, China have their own payment system that works because they're going increasingly to national currencies. So from the Russian point of view, this would be a huge pain in the neck, but it wouldn't be a disaster. They would be able to cope and they would just ramp up their own system and then give it a year or two that would be working fine. So in that sense, this is just to annoy the Russians, isn't it? I mean, it's not actually going to pressure them or force them to do anything, put it that way.
So it's not clear to me how sanctioning their domestic systems will be possible, and it's possible, of course, but it would be also very dangerous precedent. So you're right. So the domestic wholesale messaging system, which is Russia's alternative to SWIFT, and again, as we were talking, US doesn't use SWIFT for domestic purposes, right? So it has an independent system. Japan and Europe also is sort of all looking. Japan already has it. China is doing it. So it's not uncommon for domestic payment systems to actually have your own system. So Russian payment system is processing about 20% or a bit over 20% of total traffic in terms of million of messages domestically. And they can, because the system is already there and it's sort of complies with international standards, it can go up quickly, probably with some hiccups, but it can process all the domestic systems. So that is not the concern. The issue is, if you look at the Chinese system, and there's been talk since 2018, I think, about connecting the Russian-China National Advanced Payment System and the Russian system, but it's not clear they really have connected. There are some international banks in the Chinese system, including Russian ones, but there is almost nobody, I think there's nobody in the Russian system, only the Bank of China is there. So clearly that link is not working too well. Of course, it will have to come up quickly if there will be pressure on SWIFT. There are other global payment systems, and some of them are based on the blockchain technology. Right. But of course, they will not be able to take the volume, and with some US regulator has issues for other reasons.
Let me ask a very simple question. Will Germany be able to pay Russia for its gas imports if SWIFT is banned?
Short answer is no.
So doesn't that cause a huge energy crisis? I mean, you can't cut Germany off from Russian gas. I just put a piece up this morning having a look at exactly this issue, and that you can't replace Russia's imports to Europe, 200 BCM, with LNG. I mean, that would take at least 1,400 ships arriving, over the course of the year, and there just aren't that many ships. And moreover, you can't take the LNG away from Asia to supply Europe, because then you cause an energy crisis in Asia. So this whole thing is just impossible, isn't it? I mean, if you ban SWIFT and Germany can't buy gas, then you create the gas crisis we've been having this year will be like a baby party in comparison, no?
You're absolutely correct. And also there is a question of distribution of that gas within the country, right? There are terminals, and there are big terminals in the UK, which is, by the way, out of is Brexited, right? Then there's Spain, there is Italy, and a few others, but you also need France. There is also, you need a way to distribute it to the end consumer as well, which is also interesting in that kind of level of capacity. It's in that level, that volumes. But I think it's important also to step back and think, if we're disconnecting a Russian financial system or banks from the global payment systems, one does not have to go for the whole country. What, of course, the administration knows, they can start looking through individual banks and decide which ones they would like to either disconnect from the global payment systems or access to the US dollar. This doesn't have to go the same way. And of course,
interestingly, in the bill, it does specifically name 13 banks. And I looked down the list, and there's a lot of really obvious ones: Sberbank, VTB, Gazprom Bank, VEB, top the list. Then the Russia Direct Investment Fund, RDIF, is in there. But then the rest of the list gets a bit strange, because there's Alpha Bank, and I know poor Mikhail Friedman always gets targeted because he's a big oligarch. But having known Alpha Bank well and followed it, I don't see it as a sort of Kremlin vehicle. It's just a very successful commercial bank. Открытие Bank is on there, which is currently owned by the central bank, but they're just about to IPO, and UniCredit wants to buy them, because it's the fastest growing bank in the country. It's been fixed, it's clean, it's got a nice business. Promsvers, well, that's now a defense bank. Sovcom Bank, another strange one. It's a sort of regional bank, super successful, nothing to do with the Kremlin as far as I can see, and yet it's on the list. So I'm not sure how they chose the banks in the second half of the list. But this, again, is more punishment than forcing Russia to do anything, isn't it? I mean, they've picked out the biggest banks, and if you penalize Sberbank, half the country banks with Sberbank, so that's going to be a huge pain in the neck. But you're suggesting that that's the way to do it. Then you can penalize Sberbank without disrupting the system, the international system, too much. No?
It will still have a massive impact on the international system. But if they were to decide to go sort of after some of the smaller banks, that will have much less of an impact, right? So that's, and then it's more specific targeted measures saying that, yes, we can do it. But of course, it's not going to be a massive preemptive measure. And then just very quickly, just to give you a step back, a little bit perspective on Washington, until recently, most of the analytical capacity and funded capacity was focused on China. Russia was a secondary of a tenth issue. So you also do not have too many people who are experts on the topic and have studied equities and the sort of the interlinkages of the Russian financial system internally, and what does it mean and how it's connected. And just by the sheer number of bills that's been coming up, some of them was complete laundry lists and competing with each other. It tells you the level of sort of the debate that we have at the moment on the detail.
That's actually one of the scary aspects of this. The White House put out a statement this week, saying that 2/3 of Russia's revenue is from oil and gas, and then the analysts were saying, well, that was true in 2014. You know, things have changed since then. And
that is an issue.
If this is the White House and they're putting out official statements where it's appallingly researched, it suggests the level of understanding in the White House. And I'm not saying, I mean, I know people in Washington, I've talked to people in the embassy who are actually really on their game, they know, but it seems to be coming from the White House level where people are ill-informed and lashing out with these inaccurate statements. And it's scary because if that's the level of understanding, then putting a complicated, dangerous sanctions bill like this, which could cause major financial disruptions, is a dangerous thing to do, because this could go horribly wrong, as we saw with Dairy Paska's sanctions. Go on.
I do have to give a lot of credit to the team about the sanctions quality of the experts on sanctions in the current administration. You saw. Of course, sanctions on the globally financial integrated economy is extremely new, right? We started doing it really with Russian example in 2014. But since then, of course, there are a few people who developed expertise and were in think tanks in Washington, D.C. Many of them also came back to the administration. So in terms of quality of analysis on the sanctions themselves, you have some of the top experts currently in the administration. But also the way that sanctions are drafted, as you pointed out, there is also Congress and there is also administration. There is more than one cook in the kitchen, and there is also a relationship between the two of them, plus the transatlantic negotiations as well.
Right. Related to this banks and SWIFT question, although it's not in the bill, Biden said explicitly that, and he threatened this, that they would cut Russia or Russians, I don't think it was quite clear, off from the access to dollars. But again, this is related by hitting a bank and you put it on the SDN list, and then it can't use dollars. No one will trade with it. Is that right?
Absolutely, yes. You can go under individual financial institutions, and we have seen that sort of a version of that a little bit with the primary market on external debt, right? That no financial institution can facilitate issue of the primary Russian debt in the foreign in Eurobonds, which that means you can effectively not really do it in dollar, right? Because the moment you issue in dollars, US dollars, it somehow has to make its way to the wire correspondent banks, to the US-based financial institution that eventually has a US presence and access to the Fed. So that is effectively cutting off that part of foreign debt from the dollar. I mean, there are some legal speculation whether you could issue in euros, say, and link it, whether that will qualify or not, but that's too much detail.
So that brings us neatly onto the next topic, the OFZs, the Russian federal ruble-denominated bonds, but they've attracted whatever it is, $40 billion worth since Russia was hooked up to Clearstream, and now you can trade those bonds from the comfort of your dealing chair in London directly, and there's been a flood of people into them, and everyone has been overweight in OFZs because the Russia risk means that the premium makes them actually very lucrative. As an investor, they're very appealing. And this time around, the OFZs have come up many times, and there was a round of sanctions when Biden first came in where they were suggested and then taken off again, but they're back on the agenda. And the issue here is they keep banning, well, they've banned already, I think, the primary issues. When the Ministry of Finance issues them, you can't go to the auction. But that's symbolic because you can buy them 2 seconds later on the secondary market for pretty much the same price. Now they're talking about secondary, that you can't buy them or trade them at all, which is much more serious. But to what extent well, there's two questions here, but I think the main one is what extent, how important is that if you take out this $40 billion of foreign investors, because the foreign investors own about 20 of them, to what extent is that a problem? When there was a sell-off in the last crash, the Russian banks stepped in and they bought 80–90% of the issues. And I think when we talked in Ukraine, the banks don't have enough money to do that, but I'm not sure in Russia if the banks do have enough money to replace those foreign investors or not.
So just a few numbers in perspective. You're right, it is 20%, and it's about 40 billion relative to reserves of over 600, right? So it's not a big number. Russia will have a headline current account and fiscal deficit big surpluses, especially on the current account, already had last year, and it's going to have this year. So strictly speaking, it only needs to roll the debt. For the Ministry of Finance in the extreme scenario can just sit and not issue. Right. And whatever rolling that happens, the domestic banks have enough liquidity and they're still in liquidity surplus to step in and continue buying. So it's no longer. We should
put a number on the current account. It's something on the order of 120 billion, isn't it? So
yes.
That covers that 40 billion easily, if just from the trade surplus.
Just from the trade surplus, exactly, given where the commodity prices are. So it's used to be a systemic issue. So just stepping back to 2014, why there was a policy to attract foreign investors into domestic market? Because as we were building Fortress Russia strategy, the authorities realized they cannot contract fiscal fast enough. It just will be too painful. They did fiscal adjustment, which is more than average or median of fiscal adjustments under the IMF programs. So they did it themselves, just so they would be more protected against external threats, geopolitical included. So in the short term, while the fiscal adjustment was happening, the inflation targeting happened, high real rates, open capital accounts, you suck in foreigners to help you out. But at this stage, when you're already in fiscal surplus, you no longer need them. So that's why, of course, it's extremely significant to have foreign participation for the development of the curve, as you know, external and domestic. Everything gets priced off the offers curve. If you're going into a financial autarky where you have no foreign investors into your local curve, of course, pricing gets much more complicated and difficult. And the shallowness of the market becomes even more pronounced, right? It will also impact the ruble market. Already you've seen the BIS survey from the previous sanctions, ruble liquidity has dropped, and it will probably drop even further, affecting regular companies, foreign companies included. But in terms of the macro stability impact, it's a drop in the ocean.
So looking in the OFZs, having the foreigners in there makes for a more efficient market. And of course, you know, it's somebody else's money. That's good for your current account. But do you think they actually planned this or I think they must have been conscious. It's like, if we have all these foreign investors, then you can't sanction these bonds, because there's this boomerang effect with a lot of these sanctions, is that they boomerang back on the West and actually cause, you know, our companies on this side, banks, significant damage. When they sanctioned Deripaska and they went after the secondary trading, I talked to a guy at Deutsche who had like, I don't know, $40 million worth of these bonds. And he said that compliance was ringing him every day saying, sell these bonds, they're going to be illegal to hold in 2 weeks. And he was shouting back at them, I can't sell them because they're going to be illegal to hold in 2 weeks. So they're worth nothing. I can't get rid of them. And so I'm going to be stuck holding them. We're going to be stuck holding them. But I also, and again, it's not in the bill, but some people are speculating that if they do bring in very harsh sanctions against the OFZs, that there'll be a transition period, there'll be a window allowing people to sell. But then if you know that you have to sell, the prices will plummet. Although the finance ministry has also said that it would step in and just buy them from the foreigners. I mean, do we have any idea?
So let's remember there is Venezuelan case, right? Where also similar to what you were talking about, the Deripaska of sanctioning of the market, the bond market. And of course, the US Treasury did it at the time when Venezuelan market was also trading already at the low levels and sort of the liquidity was not very high. But basically, even during the transition period, it was impossible to find in the intermediary who will facilitate your offloading from a US-based investor to a non-US-based investor, because the compliance risk of saying that I guarantee you that it's not going to end up with the US-based investor is enormous. So therefore, effectively, a lot of people just couldn't sell it, similar to the Rusal situation. So you had a heavily discounted bond, and there will be nobody on the intermediating broker who will say, fine, I'm going to do it for you during this period. So there was, in a way, of writing off, of US institutions writing off this debt, and sort of giving a small present to the administration.
Yeah.
So there might be something similar to that.
Yeah, because that's one of the ironies is that if it gets sanctioned and people can't sell it, then the Ministry of Finance can just say, yeah, tough luck, guys, and we don't have to pay it. So bye, you know, we just get $40 billion for free as a result of this.
So yeah, so Ministry of Finance stepping in, buying it, they will think twice whether they need to do it. Maybe for the volatility market, yes, but they're not exactly 100% incentivized in this situation.
Right. I think those are the most, well, there's one more tricky issue to talk about, but before we do that, then one of the interesting things about this list is that there's no oligarch list. I think because the White House got egg on its face so many times trying to choose oligarchs. However, there is a list of officials, starting with Putin. Mishustin's in there, Lavrov is there, Shoigu's there. I mean, everybody from the top are going to be sanctioned. But I don't know. I think that's just for show. I don't think Putin has a house in France. I don't think there's any way of going at him. In the same way they sanctioned Lukashenko and he just laughed it off. But I guess you need to have some of that. But do you think in general this, because the SDN list does give the Treasury Department a tool to target business people. I mean, to what extent do you think that's effective? Because I was just talking to Uzbekistan this morning to some guys who, this big Hoover manufacturing company, and they want to export to Russia this year. It's their big target. And they're just about to put up a factory in Kazakhstan. And I said, what about Russia? It's much larger. And you've got serious transport problems from Central Asia to Russia. And they were like, yeah, it is attractive, but we're not going to do it now because the climate is too unpredictable. And I think that's the real cost, isn't it? I mean, the damage it does to the investment climate, this targeting big business.
And I think any sanctions already are doing huge damage to the medium-term outlook. And we see that in terms of the vibrancy of the markets is not the same. But in terms of individual sanctions, they can be very effective if they're well selected. I think sort of they're increasing the cost of doing what you're doing. It doesn't mean, so if you think about the purpose of sanctions, it can be preemptive, it can be to change your behavior, or it can be just imposing a cost, for example. So these are different objectives. And then by signaling strongly to government officials, if you continue on this path, your personal cost will keep on increasing. That could be meaningful. In some cases, I do not want to speculate whether it will change anybody's behavior. Ben, just very quickly, sorry. Do you have many examples of, I'm just not knowledgeable enough, but do you have many examples of when assets were frozen abroad based on the past sanctions?
No, nearly none. But
precisely.
But if you look at the FDI figures, I think that's where it shows. And we've always said that every big foreign investor who's in Russia already love it. I've had one company after another, French, German, Italian, it's a gold mine. We love it. This is the best market we've ever been to. And moreover, that they're reinvesting all their profits into expansion as fast as they can go. And moreover, they're making so much profits, they don't even have to draw on the parent company. So they're at no cost and even sending dividends home, although most of them have decided to reinvest. However, if you're outside Russia, you're not already in, you would never go. You just wouldn't go near it, because it looks so horrible. And consequently, the FDI numbers are basically, it's all reinvested profits. And ironically, the real FDI that's in there or has come in there over the last years, me and Ivan did a piece on it, it actually comes from the States. The States is actually the biggest investor, but it's all indirect through other countries.
I was going to actually bring that piece because, as you know very well, that net and gross FDI numbers in the balance of payments are very hard to disentangle properly, and they never show anything. It's plus minus negative during most years. But yes, you're right. The gross numbers are definitely impacted. The big chunk is coming from the US as well. But right now, in addition to the domestic rule of law concerns, you have a massive compliance risk to enter, and it will prevent a lot of people to enter. And I think that also potentially brings us to the sanctions or the rather export controls that US is thinking about.
That's the topic I wanted to come up next. And there's in this section, it's actually quite vague. The bill says just lists Russian extractive industries, oil and gas, coal, mineral extraction, and any other sector or industry the president wants to sanction. So that looks to me like it's just a blank check that they can go after any company that they want to. I mean, they haven't named Gazprom, Rosneft, which are the obvious ones, but if they want to, they can sanction those and cause, it's picking out, it's a way of threatening, because you can say that we'll just take out one big company after another and make their life hell.
What you can also go is after specific products that the US exports. So US has a lot of leeway in terms of export controls for the geopolitical or not just national security objectives. So they can name, like say, computer chips or something. They can make specific products export limited to Russia. So it doesn't even have to go on after individual company. Which is different from Europe. In Europe, you have sort of each has their own. And at the European level, you can only do export controls on the specific military related equipment.
We did a piece actually last summer saying, look, Russia's soft underbelly. If you want to sanction it, what you should sanction is not oil and gas or oligarchs. You should sanction high precision tools. And that's because Russia, it's missed 2, maybe 3 revolutions in machine tools, since it joined the Soviet Union, and there's been another one since the Soviet Union collapsed, or 2 revolutions. And so these tools are now extremely sophisticated. And Russia's been trying to diversify, and so it's increased the import of tools from China. But these are all simple tools. The really good ones, the really sexy ones, are basically the States and Germany. And you cut it off from that, then you stop industrial progress, you stop research and development. You actually hobble the economy in a really significant way, so Russia will fall further and further behind. And I don't know, I didn't get the impression. I think it's as you say. I think they're going to go after specific products, mainly computer chips, and just cut you off from that because it'd be a pain in the neck, rather than something a bit more strategically damaging.
But Russia is already fighting an uphill battle, being a commodity exporter, and diversification, as we know, from commodities and emerging markets is extremely challenging, and they're doing the best they can. They have issues with the rule of law. They have issues now with an increasing sort of economic and financial autarky, including the sort of limitations. And of course, we have the sort of global digital transformation, especially in the industry, which Russia will risk missing out on. So all that weighs on your medium term, not even long term, but medium term outlook and productivity. So it's not going to get better. I think even if we stay here after the conflict and there is no further escalation, it's still not going to get better, because once the sanctions are imposed, it's almost impossible to take them off. And I always give an example of the 1974. I forgot the name now.
Jackson Vanik.
Yes, exactly, Jackson Vanik. On the sort of people not being able to immigrate from the Soviet Union, it was never taken off. It was replaced by something else, but it was waived and waived and waived. But it's actually long after the Soviet Union broke up. So it just tells you how hard it is to take off sanctions.
The only ones that have been taken, the Deripaska ones were taken off. That's the only ones. And I think everyone admitted that was such a huge mistake.
And I think it had something to do also with the very sort of common approach from Europe responding to it, to the US. I don't think it's the benefit of anybody else, but I think it's especially European countries who said, wait a second, we cannot replace suppliers. This doesn't work, and you didn't give us enough warning. So I think that's to their credit.
I mean, the whole question of whether the sanctions are going to be imposed in this form and what Europe's going to do, which is obviously going to be very unhappy, that's all a political one. I don't think we should talk about that here. We've gone through the list of the bill, but I think at this point I'd like to ask you, so all these sanctions, how effective are they? I mean, how much of a tool are they in order to allow the US government to force Russia to change its ways? Because it seems to me, all these sanctions, that all they do is make Russia dig its heels in and do things like collect $630 billion worth of reserves. But we have said in general, they present a real cost, but not from the sanctions themselves, but in the damage it does to the investment climate. And also the fact that the government is hoarding all this money when it should be leveraging up, it should be spending the money. The economy would boom if it did that. And obviously, they've been running an austerity budget since about 2014, in effect.
Well, the question is coming back to the basic. What is your objective? Is your objective to preempt certain behaviors, change somebody's behaviors? Is your objective to make it costly? And there's relatively little sort of research and evidence on, there is, but not too much, in terms of the effectiveness of changing somebody's behavior. Because it's just too hard to link it from the economic financial sanction to the eventual geopolitical outcome, foreign policy outcome. So that is challenging. In terms of how effective they are in inflicting pain, they have been very effective. And we've seen what happened in 2014, and we just discussed what can happen if you disconnect from global payment systems or from the dollar. It would be very painful. The issue is whether it changes behavior. I think nobody has a clear idea on that.
I don't think so, knowing the Kremlin as well as I do. I don't know if I can say that, but surely at the bottom line is at the end of the day, Russia's economic potential growth at the moment is 2%. And it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be 2%. It should be a lot more. And so that's the effect of the sanctions. And Putin is prepared to accept 2% because he refuses to be told what to do. He refuses to toe the line, and he causes all these problems.
There is also a question in any country with this sort of a group of authorities that's been there at the top for a very long time. Would you rather have a smaller pie and keep your share, or have a bigger pie and lose your share?
Putin's gone for a small pie. Very specifically as well, another loose end I wanted to tie up. To what extent will all of this, I mean, particularly the threat of cutting people off from the dollar, which if you think about it, is really a significant thing, giving us the global currency of commerce. And already Russia and China have started moving to national currencies, and already people have been talking about de-dollarizing. But surely not only will Russia and China accelerate that process, because I think behind these sanctions on Russia this is all clearly a gun pointed at China too. At least I'm sure that's how they see it, not being a Chinese expert. To what extent will this accelerate? Because all the other emerging markets are like, well, I don't, let's diversify our currency. I don't want to be bullied by the States in the same way further down the road, and drive the de-dollarization process even faster, which has started, but it's going slowly.
Well, the government officials in the US over the years have made comments about it, that they are concerned that increasing sort of weaponization of interconnectedness and sort of centrality of the US dollar and the centrality of the US markets will potentially drive people away. And as we know from the example, I think Barry Eichengreen has written about it, from the example of the pound, it doesn't happen very it takes a long time to happen, but then it happens very quickly, because in the old days, pound actually used to be the leading currency at some point. So that's the issue is what Russian authorities already have done, because they are concerned. The investments in the US Treasury used to be 140, 60, 80 billion, and it's now less than 10. So that is a very big change. Of course, maybe some of it, some people speculate, has moved on to sort of other entities, but again, the drop is still very significant. Gold is now the largest share of reserves. It used to be, it's a larger share of reserves than the dollar. It used to be sort of less than 10%. Now it's 20, and dollar is about 16. It came down from 40% of Russian reserves.
And the yuan is in the basket now as well, which didn't used to be.
Exactly, and it has it's more than, I think it's more than 13% or so, and it's higher than in some other countries. Also, the regional sort of geographical distribution where Russia holds the money has also changed. We moved away a bit from, of course, partially because of gold is on domestic side. Similarly, even in trade, where you would think that euro and yuan should be higher, but you have seen the change. So the share of dollar in trade before sanctions used to be 80%. And now it's about, I think, 50-ish.
15?
No, 50. Not 15. No. It's I think 55, 54, something like that. And euro has increased significantly.
I was going to say, I mean, to what extent can you replace the dollar with the euro? I mean, that's a now widely traded currency, for all these countries in this patch. Is it viable just to drop the dollar and go to the euro?
It is absolutely viable, and you have seen an important shift during the previous US administration. You have seen a shift in Europe, where ECB, that never used to be agnostic about euro for 20 years, would say we'll do the right things on the monetary front, but we don't care about promoting euro, have changed the tune completely, with Benoit Cœuré and Draghi, and now, of course, Lagarde, making comments and writing regular update reports on the role of euro. So that has changed. And then also the Commission in 2018 changed the tune, and now we moved from commissioners considering promotion of euro, including for Europe, for energy markets. We want Russian sort of European economic sovereignty to now developing tools against economic coercion. This is a huge shift, and it didn't come just because of China and Russia.
Mm. No, I think history, they'll look back and they'll regret this, pushing Russia into China's arms, weaponizing the dollar, which encourages people to get out of it because it gives them significant amount of geopolitical power, having the dollar as a global currency. Look, we got 15 minutes left with the intention to do this for an hour. I want to briefly touch on the disruptive stuff that hasn't been specifically sanctioned, but oil, gas, agriculture, and the ruble. Maybe we can start with the ruble. It's become very sensitive to geopolitics. It's pretty much disengaged from the oil price. Oil prices this week were up to 90, and yet the ruble is down to 80 from 70, which is an enormous change. And Russian assets are incredibly cheap. It has like enormous reserves, more than 2 years. So the ruble's value should not be down at 80. And what was striking to me, though, was that last time I remember the ruble being at 80 was in 2014 with the oil shock. And Nabulina, I remember the traders were freaking out. I mean, they were screaming like rate hike, rate hike, rate hike. And Nabulina came to the rescue in the end, 17% rate hike. And this time it got to 80, or it was going to get to 80 that day. And she just said, oh, we're just going to stop buying dollars. And everything was fine. No rate hike, no panic, but we're at the 80 again. I mean, that's what's different between those two stories when she did it last time in that?
Flexible exchange rate and inflation targeting and super credible central bank. This is night and day. You know, what Nabulina and her team has done at the central bank is incredible, and how fast they managed to achieve that credibility. And as you remember, the same traders in 2013-14 were thinking they're insane. They have no market experience. Some of them were saying, why are they hiking? You need to do some special measures. You know, you don't understand trading. You're just some economist ladies coming from where. So I think chapeau to Nabulina and the brooch. I'm wearing brooches now to signal my moods. But I think it's a credibility of the central bank when we don't have to watch the ruble anymore. It has an impact, but you have low dollarization of individual credit is not dollarized at all. There is some dollarization of corporates, but many of them have also income and foreign exchange. External debt, thanks to sanctions, is much smaller and much sort of longer term. So there is pass-through, of course, from exchange rate to inflation, and inflation right now elevated. So I think she will turn potentially more hawkish if we stay here, because pass-through is possibly maybe 0.05%, you know, so it's not high, but it will have a marginal contribution for sure, especially when real incomes are not growing.
So for the market people, you think there's going to be one more hike? I mean, we thought this last 100 points in December was probably the last one, but it could be another.
I would have to watch it. And in our forecast, we don't have inflation coming into the 4% target this year.
Right.
So especially with the ruble at this level. But again, it's normal if they're targeting inflation and you want to preserve financial stability. And I think savings for the Central Bank of Russia is very important. I think they will be watching this move closely because of inflation rather than exchange.
But she must be on board with this fiscal fortress that Putin's done. I mean, in so much as she's a central bank and she's built up, you know, she was saying last year, my comfort level is $500 billion for the reserves. And, you know, she was actively pursuing that. But as a central banker, you look at that reserves, it's just insanely in excess of what you need to run the financial system. So, I mean, she's as much as an architect as Putin in this, or at least she's the mechanic that makes it happen, no?
Well, there is an incredible coordination between the president's economic team, Ministry of Finance, and the central bank. And it has happened throughout since the sanctions in 2013-14. Maybe there was some sort of period of working together, but the Ministry of Finance and the central bank work very closely and cooperate very closely, and as well as with the president's administration. So it's definitely very much a coordinated strategy. There is relatively little discord. I'm not going to comment on the Ministry of Economy at times, right? But that is because of the different incentives. Ministry of Economy would like to see stronger growth. So that's natural that there's some tensions occur in any country. In terms of reserves, that they surpass anything. There is some dollarization of deposits, so which I have to say I was a bit surprised to find that the dollarization still is in the 20s, which was this kind of credibility of central bank dollarization, speaking more broadly. It can be dollar or euro or any other non-ruble currency. So with that, I think they have about 200 billion of that in dollars, or sort of in converted to dollars. So you need a little bit of reserves in case, for example, you have a chop off from the US dollar and you need to still meet those obligations, help the banks meet those obligations. And also in terms of external debt, I think the total external debt is also about, in dollars, is about 200 billion. It's 478 total and 200 billion in dollars. So you need some reserves for that, for the extreme scenario where you might not be able to access the dollars at all, right?
Okay, moving on from the ruble, one of the other vulnerabilities is the exports. I mean, they could go after gas, oil, and agriculture. But I was reading a note this morning, and the oil analyst was saying trying to sanction Russian oil exports is kamikaze option for Europe. And we already mentioned with the gas cutting, because the Economist ran a piece saying can Europe get by gas off? But then you talk to the oil and gas people, like, that's never going to happen, just because it would be such a disaster. It'd be like dropping a nuclear bomb, mutually assured destruction for both Russia and Europe at the same time. So can we just completely discount those scenarios?
I don't think we can completely discount those scenarios, because US imports, it is actually imports Russian oil, and it imports more from Russia than it does from Saudi.
And
let's not forget that.
The imports from Russia have gone up recently.
Yes, sharply, yes.
From Venezuela. So here's a parity, yeah.
Yeah, so there, but abstracting from that, for US, it doesn't have any systemic importance. Of course, with the concerns about inflation, and we've seen Powell this week, we have, of course, this massive spike in commodity prices will also have an impact on the global economy, because the central banks will be under pressure to hike more, even though we still have the new variants of COVID and not a full recovery. So that will have global spillovers even to the US. But I don't think it's going to be fully discounted, because from the US administration and Congress point of view, it's mentioned less in recent weeks, but it's not completely discounted. For Europe, it will be devastating.
Yeah, no, I agree. I just did a piece looking at it, and it doesn't make any sense to do. Look, last question, and this is actually probably one of the, I've just been thinking about this and reading about it, the agriculture. If Russia invades Ukraine, it's going to go into East Ukraine, which is where all the grain fields are. Ukraine has now 4 years in a row, each year, broken last year's record with export and production. And it's on course to do the same again. But if there's a war there, you're going to take the whole Ukrainian production of grain out of the market. And the problem there is, one of the unintended benefits of the fight you have with Russia is that it's diversified its export, particularly of grain. And if you go into the Middle East and Lebanon and Egypt, it's anything between a fifth and a third of those countries' imports of wheat is Ukrainian wheat. And if this suddenly disappears, you're going to get prices going through the roof. But the food inflation that's already been running, I read, is food inflation is now to a similar level it was when the Arab Spring happened. So if you provide a grain shock, bread prices doubling, isn't this a catastrophe situation, scenario? Couldn't you, I mean, I'm speculating on whether there's going to be another Arab Spring, but certainly the conditions will be recreated. I mean, to what extent should we be scared of that? That the problem with food security in Europe if you remove Ukraine's grain production?
I think you're right to be concerned, and it also shows the resilience of the Ukrainian economy, that the pivot that we were just talking about, from export reliance mostly on Russian certain products, FDI reliance also mostly on Russia, it has pivoted completely towards Europe. And the compliance with European standards for exports has helped them a lot to gain new markets, because they're complying, and they have more trust from other buyers as well, and that helped them to diversify also more globally with their products. So definitely it will have a huge impact. We've seen very strong harvests recently, contributing to the positive terms of trade for Ukraine. It's hard to speculate what exactly political outcomes it lead to, but it pushes back to already high inflation. And emerging markets, don't forget, have already started hiking and tightening their fiscal policies already last year, even though they're still on uneven footing. the DM markets had a bit more time. So if on top of the current wave of inflation, we have another one, it will have very impactful for growth of emerging markets.
Yeah, no, a shockwave, I think, that would go around the world. Look, we should stop there. Fascinating talk. Lovely to see you. We've done our hour. I was thinking about doing questions, but I think we should come back to this and then do a more interactive session next time. But I wanted to go through all these questions to get a sound idea of where we're standing in terms of this fight coming up. And it looks like the Biden administration is revving up to put sanctions on Russia, irrespective of what happens. And I don't see this argument over NATO expansion ending well, because the Russians have dug their heels in. So I'm sure we'll be doing crisis scenarios next, hopefully not Ukrainian invasions. Elena, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. It was really, really interesting.
Thank you so much, Ben. Always a pleasure. And you're as expert as more expert than most on this region.
That's a big compliment coming from you. And to everyone listening, I would like to thank you for taking the time and staying with us all this time. I hope you found that as interesting as me. Last thing I'll do is plug BNE. We are writing about this stuff every day. And if you go to our website, IntelliNews.com/welcome, you can take a trial for the pro service, a premium service that we offer, where we're following this all in depth on a daily basis, and not just Russia, but the whole patch, the whole of emerging Europe down into Central Asia, and also into North Africa now. So once again, thanks very much for participating. We shall have another one of these, I think, as soon as next week, where we're going to talk about business and Ukraine, talking to some business leaders about how all this is affecting them, and at the same time have a representative from Moscow looking at the same from the perspective of the pragmatists who are trying to continue to run their businesses in the midst of all this madness. Until then, take care. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.